Trample on snakes.
It is a very graphic channel.
Trample on snakes.
It is not for the weak of heart.
Welcome to today's edition of Well, 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 the show where we talk about how to be your physical best. Now, some of you dear listeners have been writing in about some sort of plague that's supposed to be going around Wellington Wells. Now, first of all, don't be ridiculous. If there were plague, wouldn't you expect to notice dead bodies in the streets strewn here and there? But you don't notice them, do you? But I want to address some of the wilder claims people have been writing to me about. For example, this chap, Constable Bill Blake of Trim Street, St. George's Home. And he writes that some of the wastrels have become quite incoherent and belligerent. And, well, he chalks it up to plague. Well, you don't have to blame it on plague, do you? I mean, I'd be belligerent if I were off my joy. Who knows? I might go around murdering people in the middle of the night and leave a trail of corpses missing their kidneys. But I do take my joy, don't I? If those poor wastrels would just go back on their joy, you wouldn't hear another thing about plague. But that's not the half of it. Mrs. E.H. Undershaft of the Tyning Maiden Home claims to have heard plague-afflicted wastrels speaking in Old English. What an imagination you have, Mrs. Undershaft. Now, I remember when you used to read as Beowulf and did all the voices. Mrs. Undershaft, they're probably speaking English and you've just gone slightly deaf. So, there's nothing to worry about.
To call it a matter of life and death is not hyperbole. With the fourth wave of COVID-19 rolling across Europe, physicians here in Germany are warning of disastrous trade-offs as intensive care units reach capacity and patients are transferred abroad for treatment. Hospitals are seeing younger and sicker patients than in prior waves, especially amongst the unvaccinated. In Germany, some 15 million people still lack immunity because they haven't had the jab. Calls for mandatory vaccination are growing louder. Neighboring countries like Austria are leading the way.
The whole of Germany is one big outbreak. This is a national emergency. By the end of this winter, pretty much everyone in Germany will have been vaccinated, recovered, or died. This may sound cynical, but it's true. It's a matter of life and death.
It looks like a majority of Germans are actually often in favor of either the level of restrictions we have or even more restrictions.
Clearly, many people trust online websites, including conspiracy websites, including fake news websites, far more than they trust their public officials. Aren't they, to some degree, to blame for the situation that we see in the hospitals?
The hardcore anti-vaccine people who you will never, I think, convince them. You really have to convince these guys.
As debate rages here in Germany, neighboring countries are taking drastic action in the face of ongoing vaccine hesitancy of the type we're talking about. Austria, for example, crossed a crucial threshold last week. Will other countries follow suit?
Austria will be the first European country to make vaccination compulsory from February. A full lockdown, including for the vaccinated, is currently in place until mid-December. After that, it will only affect the unvaccinated. In Vienna, 35,000 people protested against the measures. We don't want vaccination to be enforced from the 1st of February. It won't stop at mandatory vaccination. It will be like this forever.
In fact, Germany's soon-to-be Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has not ruled out compulsory vaccination. What would you advise the new German government? Is it time to take more decisive action? And if so, more in the direction of Austria or more in the direction of France?
Okay, so first of all, I think it's very good that he hasn't ruled it out. I personally have always been against mandatory vaccination. I think it's right to have this debate now. I think the debate itself might already, clarify that's the kind of communication we need. I wish we'd built the kind of public health infrastructure that allows us to do things like that. We probably don't even know who the unvaccinated people are we need to target, and that's a huge problem.
Susanne Schreiber, you mentioned in your opening statement that the German's Ethics Council has issued a recommendation. What is it? Mandatory vaccination, at least for some?
Yes, it's mandatory vaccination. We have asked politicians to now really check whether they couldn't enforce something like that. We need to do something. Mandatory vaccinations for everyone, that's the game changer, and that changes the game.
A general mandate for vaccination?
We don't like lockdown. Nobody like lockdown, no. I hope the same things happen in Germany, because I read in the news that some of the people not yet vaccinated, so I prefer that they have to vaccinate. They have to be vaccinated.
I want to start and ask for your reaction to this report that is coming out tonight that Olaf Scholz, set to become the new chancellor, reportedly saying that he would back mandatory vaccinations for everyone in Germany as early as February.
I think we have to acknowledge that public support for general vaccine mandates is surging, and also many of my colleagues are now understanding that we won't prevent a fifth or sixth wave of COVID infections if we don't have vaccination rates above 90%. And it's quite unlikely that we are going to have vaccination rates above 90% without vaccine mandates. And that's why the discussion about vaccine mandates is very likely to be held in Parliament quite soon.
And is that going to be the new government stance? You're not going to support new lockdowns, but you are going to support requiring everyone to be vaccinated.
Yes, it's true. We are going to see if there is a majority in Parliament for general vaccine mandates, and I think the decision about that is going to be made in the next weeks.
The new chancellor says, yes, we are in favor of requiring everyone to get their shots.
To all those people who say that vaccine mandates would lead to further disruption of society, I say the current measures, the need for prolonged anti-COVID measures because not enough people are vaccinated, those are causing more disruption in society than any vaccine mandate ever could.
And is there a plan if the mandates are put into force, if people resist and just say, no, I will not be vaccinated, and civil disobedience, if you will, is there a plan on how to enforce the mandates?
I mean, this wouldn't be the first vaccine mandate in history. We've had vaccine mandates before, and in fact, we currently do have measles vaccine mandates, for example, for healthcare workers. So it usually works with monetary fines, and of course people are not going to be dragged to vaccination places, but it's very likely that there are going to be fines. I think for many people this is going to be a very strong, very clear reason to opt for vaccination. I think that we do have, as a society, we do have to accept the fact that after multiple virus variants, we now have a virus that requires vaccination rates so high that they can't be achieved in Germany without mandates. I do think that vaccine mandates are required.
And therefore, I think it is understandable and appropriate to lead this discussion now, how we can encourage and potentially think about mandatory vaccination within the European Union. This needs discussion. This needs a common approach, but it is a discussion that I think has to be led. It is a race against time. This is of utmost importance, and therefore my line at the very end, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I want the second part to win.
As the pandemic surges through Germany, we're starting to see some pretty terrifying imagery on social media, as this image is allegedly from a German supermarket where you have a section for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and you're also seeing other images where it looks like a very, very similar thing that we've seen before in Germany, and it's terrifying because you're looking at just these supermarket images. That's not bad enough. You're also seeing the police crack down on protesters against the mandates, and I'll stop the video right there because it gets a little bit dicey for YouTube, but also the idea that I've shown this image before, this video before, of the police just walking through, this looks like a salon, just asking for people's papers because they want to get their hair cut, and it's just terrifying because this has been seen before, where you have something like Germany where it's like, yeah, you have this regular store over here with this word, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but if you trust Google Translate, this is actually saying unvaccinated, undesirable, handwritten on the side of a building. And it's like, yeah, their cases are skyrocketing over in Germany, so they're trying to do their best for it. But it's one of those things where a lot of people try to compare what's happening in the world right now to Nazi Germany. Oh, this is just like Nazi Germany. Well, at what point in time can we start comparing what's happening in Canada to Austria or Australia to just Germany today? Not even Germany from the 1940s, just Germany today, which is a crazy thing because they know what happened. There's lots of stuff, there's lots of laws in Germany where they can't talk about the history because they don't want it repeating itself, and it's the idea that it's like they're failing an open book test. They know what atrocities can occur from this type of behavior, and yet they're still doing it.
Well, the measures were announced by Angela Merkel, the outgoing chancellor after 6 years in office, and the incoming chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And basically, just as you said, if you're not vaccinated, and 69% of the population is vaccinated, you will be able to go grocery shopping, you'll be able to go to the pharmacy, you'll be able to go to a bakery, and that's about it. So forget going to the cinema, forget going to the restaurant, forget going to museums and so on. All of that is no longer allowed. The other big measure that was announced is that the new government in the new legislature will be pushing for a vaccine mandate. In other words, you will have to get vaccinated by the beginning of February, probably. You won't have any choice in the matter. This law project has to go before an ethics council. Of course, there has to be a discussion about it, and there will be a free vote in Parliament. Olaf Scholz, who is the incoming chancellor, expected to be sworn in next week, said, of course, he would vote for it. He issued a personal appeal. And Angela Merkel, who is entirely leaving the political stage in Germany, who won't have a seat in the next legislature, said she personally, when asked, would vote for it as well. So those two things go together. There's a lot of pressure, basically, now on getting the people who aren't vaccinated vaccinated. I mean, it's hard to see how you can escape the unpleasantness of not being able to, you know, go into all of the places that other people can go into. If you want to go buy shoes, for instance, that appears to be off limits, or to go to the cinema, that's not going to be happening. And there's actually another measure that I should have mentioned, where if I want to, for instance, spend time with my neighbors or I can meet with one other household and two people from that other household. So there's a lot of restrictions and a whole bunch more as to public gatherings and so on. So there's that pressure. And then coming into the new year, it looks like you will have to get vaccinated. So there is in Germany different groups of people who are against vaccination for different reasons. There's a lot of vaccine skepticism in the former East Germany, where there's just a mistrust of authority. If you look at Saxony, it's not even over 60% there. That's part of the former East Germany. And there's groups of people who, particularly on the far right, who are against the measures, the lockdown measures in the name of freedom. But I think, you know, basically, as the Berlin mayor was saying at the press conference, listen, Germans, you're used to not crossing at a red light at 2 a.m. in the morning, even when there's a police officer here. We're counting on you to follow the rules without having somebody looking over your shoulder. So, you know, we'll just see if that actually is what takes place. But it looks like it's going to be pretty hard to not get vaccinated in Germany coming into the new year.
And in some breaking news now from Germany, tough new coronavirus restrictions for people who have not been vaccinated have just been announced in response to the Omicron variant. The new restrictions meant that unvaccinated people will be banned from many public facilities and non-essential shops. The outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel said that vaccines could be made mandatory by February next year if the German Parliament approves it. Let's go straight to our correspondent Jenny Hill, who joins us now from Berlin. And Jenny, these tough new measures have just been announced.
Yes, they have, although actually Germany being the kind of country it is, a federal country where states make a lot of their own decisions, some of these tough restrictions have been in place in the worst hit regions now for some weeks. So, for example, in Saxony, unvaccinated people are not able to go into restaurants, bars, shops now across the country, with the exception, of course, of very vital shops, grocery shops, chemists and so on. The idea being to try and put the squeeze on the millions of Germans who've not yet taken up the offer of a vaccine. That's what experts say is certainly in part behind the soaring infection rates that we've seen here in recent weeks. Germany is experiencing a fourth wave of the pandemic, and it is the worst yet, with intensive care units in some hospitals saying they are full to bursting, and some are actually having to transfer patients to other parts of the country. So Angela Merkel has held one of these regular meetings with regional leaders to try and come up with a countrywide solution. So you've heard about the restrictions on unvaccinated people not being able to go into shops. We also understand that they won't be allowed to mix with more than 2 people from another household in private setting. How you police such a measure is, of course, another matter. But the point is that here in Germany, the focus is very much on trying to drive up the vaccination rate. And you spoke about Angela Merkel talking about mandatory vaccination. This is really interesting, actually, from Mrs. Merkel, because all the way through, she said she doesn't like the idea of mandatory vaccination. It's up to government to persuade citizens to be vaccinated, she said. Today, in the press conference that's just gone by, she was asked, you know, when this goes to the vote in the Bundestag. There's no date set yet, incidentally, but at that point, would you, were you a politician yourself, an MP, a Member of Parliament, would you vote for it? And she said, yes, you know, were I a Member of Parliament, actually, I would now vote for that measure.
We start with COVID vaccinations expected to be made compulsory for people in Germany from February. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has described the situation in Germany as very serious, saying COVID cases are far too high. Let's bring in our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons. Well, this is going to cause some controversy, Adam.
Yeah, it will cause considerable controversy. It's not 100% guaranteed. We should say that because this is not something that can just be brought in. Certainly not by Angela Merkel, who's just about to leave office, nor indeed by Olaf Scholz, the man who is 99.99 recurring % likely to succeed her as Chancellor. It will require a vote in the German Parliament, in the Bundestag. It will be an open vote, so parliamentarians will vote on their conscience. But Mr. Scholz says that he expects it to pass, and all polls suggest that actually Germans are in favour of this. It's a big change of direction, though, because up until recently, Mrs. Merkel said that she wanted the onus to be on persuading Germans to get vaccinated in sufficient quantities. But so far, that vaccination rate in Germany is about 67.5%. It's just not seen as being anywhere near high enough. And so this vaccine mandate is likely to come into effect as soon as February. It will be enormously controversial. Austria, neighbouring Austria, has already said it will do the same thing, bringing in a mandate on the 1st of February. But interestingly, Germany hasn't stopped there. It is also bringing in what has been referred to as the lockdown of the unvaccinated, which will effectively create 2 tiers of citizenship. I don't really see any other way of putting it, because if you are not vaccinated, you will not be allowed to go to non-essential shops, and you will not be allowed to go to leisure activities. Effectively, you will be curtailed in your movements. Now, Germany will not be alone in that. You look at other countries. Italy, for instance, obliges people to either be tested or recovered or vaccinated if they are to go into their workplace. But actually, to make this differential between vaccinated and unvaccinated is a big step for the European Union's biggest, wealthiest, probably most influential country. This happens at a moment when Olaf Scholz is taking over. Noticeably, I think another German, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, just yesterday said that the EU needed to start having a conversation about mandatory vaccinations. I suspect she had an eye on what was going on in her home country. And it will be, without any doubt, controversial. As I said, there is a majority in favour of these kind of enhanced actions in Germany. But we know that in Germany, as in so many other countries, there is a sizable minority of people who have not been vaccinated, not because of health, not because of youth, but because they do not want to be vaccinated and have resisted every siren call to change their mind. And those people are already complaining vociferously that they have been stigmatized, that they have been cut out of society, and that it is frankly unfair to have one set of rules for the vaccinated, one set for the unvaccinated. And I wonder whether it will only be the unvaccinated who compare, or whether there will be others, people who have had the vaccine, people who sign up to vaccine programs, but are still troubled by this state idea of there being effectively a two-tier society.
In Germany, vaccinations could become mandatory. A draft law, which has the support of incoming Chancellor Olaf Scholz, will be submitted to the Bundestag. If passed, compulsory jabs could begin in February. Just over 68% of Germans are vaccinated, well below the national target of 75%. Restrictions have been tightened on unvaccinated people.
We will reserve access to cultural and recreational facilities and events throughout Germany, regardless of the incidence, only to those who have been vaccinated and cured. It is also possible to do an additional test for those with a complete vaccination plan.
We go now to our reporter Kate Brady, who's live for us in Berlin. So, Kate, Germany is following Austria, proposing these mandatory COVID vaccines, subject, of course, to a parliamentary vote. How is all of this being received?
Well, this actually falls in line with public opinion right now. We've seen that jump some 20 percentage points since August, from about 39% to about 56% now in favour of mandatory vaccines here in Germany. And it seems, just from having spoken to people, especially here in Berlin, that patience is wearing thin the longer that people who are fully vaccinated, many people already lining up in the December temperatures to go and get a booster shot as well now, are just no longer want to try and have to follow these rules because they've done everything they can to try and protect themselves and others. They see this as negligence, is what some people have said to me, at least on behalf of some of the 12 million people who have not yet decided to be vaccinated. But on top of the likelihood of a mandatory vaccination here in Germany, Angela Merkel also pointed out this evening that the second vaccination for people who had 2 doses of a COVID-19 vaccination, of course for Johnson & Johnson that will have just been 1, she was saying that that would actually only be valid for 9 months, that second shot, and that is really a call for people to go and get a booster shot right now, which has been available for some weeks here in Germany.
Now, Kate, you mentioned also that those who are unvaccinated, now further restrictions, further measures are coming into place in Germany, of course, for those who are unvaccinated, and pretty much they're not going to be allowed into non-essential shops and public spaces. How and when do these restrictions actually kick into gear?
So we're expecting them to kick in around the 13th or 14th of December because of some recent changes to the infection protection law, as they call it here in Germany. There's a few tweaks that need to be made and passed through Parliament. So it's probably going to be just over a week from now. But of course, as we've heard from state premiers time and time again over the last few months as well, they will be encouraging people to try and follow these new rules wherever possible. And of course, it is at the discretion of small retailers, for example, as well. Even just here in Berlin, many of them were already trying to follow the so-called so-called 2G rule, where they demand proof of vaccination or that you're recently recovered. Some places here in Berlin were demanding that before it even became a rule. But as you say, a lot of new measures that really are targeting the unvaccinated. They'll only be so in a gathering, for example, you'll only be able to of unvaccinated or people who can't prove that they've recently recovered, and they'll only be able to be one household and then a maximum of 2 other people from one other household as well, which is miles away from what's allowed for vaccinated and recovered people right now. But otherwise, in the coming weeks, if you're unvaccinated, there's not really going to be very much to do here in Germany apart from go to the drugstore or go to the supermarket. All cultural leisure facilities, you're going to have to prove that you're either vaccinated or fully recovered to get in.
Also ich muss ganz ehrlich sagen, dass wir jetzt in einer so starken 4. Welle sind, das stimmt mich nicht froh, sondern das bedrückt mich, gerade wenn ich bestimmte regionale Situationen sehe. Und deshalb setze ich mich und habe ich mich jetzt ja auch bis zum Schluss dafür eingesetzt, dass wir diese 4. Welle möglichst schnell brechen. Deshalb haben wir heute von einem Akt der nationalen Solidarität gesprochen, damit wir sinkende Infektionszahlen bekommen und unser Gesundheitssystem eben nicht überlasten, sondern entlasten. Eine allgemeine Impfpflicht soll im Deutschen Bundestag diskutiert und entschieden werden. Dazu bitten Bund und Länder den Ethikrat, sich bis Jahresende eine Empfehlung zu erarbeiten. Und dann kann diese allgemeine Impfpflicht könnte bei entsprechender Entscheidung greifen, etwa ab Februar 2022. Das heißt, wäre ich im Deutschen Bundestag, könnte ich sagen, dass ich mich dafür aussprechen würde. Also auch dafür stimmen würde. Und ich glaube, wir haben alle gehofft, dass die Freiwilligkeit hier besser angenommen wird. Wir werden bundesweit einen Zugang zu Einrichtungen und Veranstaltungen der Kultur- und Freizeitgestaltung unabhängig von der Inzidenz nur für Geimpfte und Genesene ermöglichen. Es kann ergänzend auch ein Test, noch einmal 2G+ genannt, gefordert werden. Die 2G-Regeln werden auch auf den Einzelhandel ausgeweitet. Ausgenommen sind die Geschäfte des täglichen Bedarfs. Also überall, wo nicht alle Teilnehmer geimpft und genesen sind, gilt diese Grenze: eigener Haushalt sowie höchstens 2 weitere Personen. Kinder bis zur Vollendung des 14. Jahres sind hiervon ausgenommen. Spätestens ab einer Inzidenz von mehr als 350 Neuinfektionen in 7 Tagen pro 100.000 Einwohner werden Clubs und Diskotheken in Innenräumen geschlossen. Es wird ja auch auf der Ebene der EU diskutiert, dass nach 9 Monaten die 2. Impfung ihre Gültigkeit verliert. Das heißt, das Boostern, das Nachimpfen, das Auffrischungsimpfen ist ganz wichtig, um dann als vollständig geimpft zu gelten. Sie sehen an den Beschlüssen, dass wir verstanden haben, dass die Lage sehr ernst ist.
Und deshalb ist es jetzt auch vertretbar zu sagen, es gibt diese Zugangsbeschränkung, weil ja jeder und jede die Möglichkeit hat, durch eine eigene Impfung die Lage für sich zu verändern und genügend Impfstoff zur Verfügung steht und jeder das hätte längst machen können. Es müssen sich diejenigen noch durchringen, sich impfen zu lassen, die das bisher nicht gemacht haben. Und das ist auch an dieser Stelle mein ganz persönlicher Appell, dass wir alle überzeugen, den Schritt jetzt zu gehen. Es ist wirklich wichtig und wir wissen jetzt endgültig, dass es eine Konsequenz hat, dass ein großer Teil der Bürgerinnen und Bürger sich bisher nicht durchgerungen hat, sich impfen zu lassen.
Im Übrigen haben wir auch nochmal das Feuerwerksverbot fürs Jahresende aus dem letzten Jahr wiederholt. Auch das ein Mindeststandard.
Let's get into this first story. We got it from CNN. I love using CNN as a source when we have horrifying stories because now it has to be true, right?
As the world waits for the impact of the Omicron coronavirus variant against current vaccines, countries where vaccines are prevalent are losing patience with those who haven't gotten the jab. Germany, in the midst of a big COVID surge, has just announced it is banning unvaccinated people from all but the most essential businesses. They'll also face contact restrictions in private settings.
Well, Becky, I think one of the things that you've just said is exactly what the German government feels, and Angela Merkel and her designated successor said as well. They are losing patience with people who so far have refused or have not gotten vaccinated yet. And so therefore, the lockdown measures that were announced today, those tougher restrictions, they essentially count only for unvaccinated people. And one of the things that's being sort of talked about here in German media and in German society is that this is essentially a lockdown for the unvaccinated. Now, unvaccinated are essentially being locked out of all businesses except for the most essential ones, like, for instance, supermarkets and pharmacies as well. But you're also, for instance, talking about recreational indoor sports facilities, indoor clubs, and things of that nature as well. Also, on top of that, the Germans are saying that above a certain infection rate, things like discos and bars will also be shut down in the areas where those high infection rates exist. The German government is saying, this is Angela Merkel and her designated successor, we of course have a new incoming government here in the next couple of days. They are saying they want more people to get vaccinated. Also put forward a really ambitious plan as well, because one of the ways that they want to come to terms with this latest massive wave of infections is more vaccinations and more booster shots. And they say they want to administer up to 30 million shots, that's both boosters and first vaccinations, before the end of the year. And finally, Becky, and this is really something very important and certainly a big change in tone among German politicians, both Angela Merkel and her successor were saying that they are open and in favor of mandatory vaccinations. Now, of course, a touchy subject here in this country. They say they want the German government to draft a law. They want the ethics committee of the German parliament to then talk about it and give recommendations. And there could be a vote and mandatory vaccinations here in this country come February. So we're certainly seeing a big change in tone here in this country, and certainly a big, I wouldn't call it a crackdown, but certainly a lockdown, if you will, for unvaccinated people, Becky.
Wir werden bundesweit einen Zugang zu Einrichtungen und Veranstaltungen der Kultur- und Freizeitgestaltung unabhängig von der Inzidenz nur für Geimpfte und Genesene ermöglichen. Es kann ergänzend auch ein Test, noch einmal 2G Plus genannt, gefordert werden. Die 2G-Regeln werden auch auf den Einzelhandel ausgeweitet. Ausgenommen sind die Geschäfte des täglichen Bedarfs. Also ich muss ganz ehrlich sagen, dass wir jetzt in einer so starken vierten Welle sind, das stimmt mich nicht froh, sondern das bedrückt mich, gerade wenn ich bestimmte regionale Situationen sehe. Und deshalb setze ich mich und habe ich mich jetzt ja auch bis zum Schluss dafür eingesetzt, dass wir diese vierte Welle möglichst schnell brechen. Eine allgemeine Impfpflicht soll im Deutschen Bundestag diskutiert und entschieden werden. Dazu bitten Bund und Länder den Ethikrat, sich bis Jahresende eine Empfehlung zu erarbeiten. Und dann kann diese allgemeine Impfpflicht könnte bei entsprechender Entscheidung greifen, etwa ab Februar 2022.
Germany has announced major restrictions on anyone who's not vaccinated against COVID-19, banning them from all but essential shops in an attempt to fend off a fourth wave of the virus. And the Chancellor Angela Merkel says vaccines may become compulsory from February. Here, as it emerged that a booster jab may be needed every year, the government confirmed it's ordered 114 million more doses from Pfizer and Moderna.
Red alert in Germany. Intensive care staff at this Bavarian hospital lit the wards red to warn Germans of the threat from COVID amid its worst wave of infection so far. The government has announced a ban on the unvaccinated entering bars, restaurants and non-essential shops.
Das ist die Situation, mit der wir
This is the situation we are confronted with, and it's also clear what we need to achieve first. Those who've not been vaccinated yet need to do so.
And they could go further, with plans for vaccination to be made mandatory as early as February next year. Germany's wave is being driven by the Delta variant, but Omicron is continuing to spread globally, with cases confirmed in more countries, including India and France.
For many weeks now, it's been on the table as leaders have discussed how to get a handle on a surge in COVID-19 infections that we've recorded in Germany, because really we are seeing numbers that were unimaginable during the second and third wave of the pandemic when, again, Germany was struggling at that time just to get a handle on it. But But of course, the outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel announcing alongside her likely successor and the 16 state leaders today that there will be some form of a lockdown for the unvaccinated portion of the German population because they are still posing a health risk to much of the population. What does that mean exactly? Well, they will be restricted from all parts of public life that aren't deemed to be essential. So sure, they can go grocery shopping or an urgent trip to the post office if needed, but they will not be able to enjoy going to the restaurant, getting a coffee, or going to see a cultural activity like a theater or museum. Angela Merkel really said this was essential in terms of being able to break the fourth wave of the pandemic, which she said Germany has not done yet, despite a slight dip in cases.
We will reserve access to cultural and recreational facilities and events throughout Germany only to those who have been vaccinated or have recovered from the virus. It's also possible to do an additional test for those with a complete vaccination plan. These rules also cover the retail trade, although supermarkets and other essential shops are excluded.
Here in the EU capital of Brussels, we heard European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen talking about the idea that it's time for European member states who are struggling with the surge in infections to start talking about potentially imposing mandatory vaccinations with these COVID-19 jabs. So far, we've seen Austria do it for the general population. That will start in February. And of course, Greece will do it as well, but that's just for the portion over 60 years old. Now it looks like Germany is headed for that, with Olaf Scholz, the incoming chancellor, likely to be put in that job on December 8th, saying that he is in favor of it. He's going to put it to a vote in the German parliament once his government is installed, and he seems very confident that he will be able to get this approved. But of course, it won't be easy, despite the fact that we've seen a lot of people saying they support it, nearly 72% of German population according to a recent survey. There is still 20% who says it imposes on their freedom, and often this is a very loud and opinionated portion of the population, and we're likely to see similar demonstrations to what we saw in Vienna when a similar mandate was imposed, where people really take to the streets and tell the government this is not what they want. So I think as we see these new restrictions and changes to the way German life goes ahead in the next few weeks, it is likely to be a very complicated period going forward.
Germany locks down unvaccinated people as leaders plan to make shots compulsory. CNN says unvaccinated people will be banned from accessing all but the most essential businesses, such as supermarkets and pharmacies, to curb the spread of the coronavirus. Outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel and her successor Olaf Scholz announced Thursday following crisis talks with regional leaders those who have recently recovered from COVID-19 are not covered by the ban. The pair also backed proposals for mandatory vaccinations, which, if voted through the parliament, could take effect from February at the earliest. Okay, this is happening. It has been 2 years, and they're still saying, don't worry, if we do this, it'll stop the spread of COVID. People have said COVID is endemic. It's a part of our lives now. It'll be seasonal like the flu. Let me just add to that, the authoritarianism is now endemic as well. Countries will keep implementing completely BS policies. They'll keep expanding the mandates. And my understanding, and I believe this might be in here, what I was reading is that they said vaccines will be mandatory and they will expire every 9 months. Let me see if I can find that in here. It was in a different, here we go. She had that vaccinated people will lose their vaccination status 9 months after getting their last shot, apparently in an effort to encourage booster uptake. What that means is there is no limit to the amount of shots you have to get. They are saying once every 9 months you must get a shot.
Welcome to the New World Order, the new normal. And what was Einstein's definition of insanity? Because it seems like we're living it every single day. This is just crazy. There's these video footages, there's these photos coming out of people being segregated in a supermarket from being vaxxed and unvaxxed. There's police officers walking around rudely interrupting people's private dinners, rudely interrupting people's haircuts, being like, give me your gosh darn paperwork right now. I've been making my own German translations of them on my own YouTube channel, but that's a separate topic. But it's absolutely ridiculous to have a concept, an idea where the state needs to have you have your paperwork everywhere you go, not just your identification, your medical records, and to have permission from the state to live your life like a normal person? Who gave them this power?
There are two things that have happened in Germany today, two big announcements. And if we unpick them, one is about exactly as you were just saying, effectively a lockdown for the unvaccinated. Now, this could actually come into play pretty shortly, and this would see people who have effectively chosen not to take the vaccine being barred from essential shops, being barred from leisure and culture facilities, while their friends and relatives who have been vaccinated are allowed into those shops. I don't think there's any way of presenting that as anything other than a two-tier society. Effectively, this is not so much a nudge to people to try to get them vaccinated as a massive wallop in the back. Now, critics will say that this is stigmatising to them. Supporters, I think, would probably agree, but I think there is some unease about the idea of telling people that they can't live the same life as others. I have to say there are plenty in German society who support that. Polls suggest that will get pretty popular support. The other thing that the Germans have announced today is the proposal for mandatory vaccination. It's a bit more complicated, this one. It would have to go through the German parliament, the Bundestag. It has the backing of Angela Merkel, Chancellor, at least the Chancellor now. She's about to leave that job. She says she would support that, even though in the past she said that this really has to be a voluntary process. But her successor, Olaf Scholz, also supports this. He's pretty much in charge now, and he said it will be a free vote in the Bundestag, but he thinks it is likely to go through. And I think this could have huge implications. Now, Austria has already said that it will follow this process of a mandatory vaccination. But to be blunt, there is one thing for Austria to do, quite another for Germany, the richest and most populous country in the European Union.
With the number of coronavirus infections rising, queues at German vaccination centers have been getting longer. But for incoming Chancellor Olaf Scholz, demand for the jab is still not high enough.
So many people are now in intensive care units because too many have not been vaccinated. Therefore, and under the circumstance that we have enough vaccines, it is a morally justifiable position to say that in order to protect all of us, everyone should be vaccinated if possible.
Until now, Scholz and Angela Merkel's outgoing government had ruled out mandatory vaccination. Now both have reconsidered, as hospitals are sounding the alarm. Over the past few weeks, COVID-19 infections have reached record highs, and many clinics had to send patients to other parts of the country for treatment. Politicians and virologists have blamed the strong fourth wave mainly on those who are resisting the jab. That's why the government has decided on what's ultimately a lockdown for the unvaccinated. Under the so-called 2G rule, people who have not been vaccinated or recovered from COVID-19 will be barred from public events and spaces such as non-essential shops, restaurants and gyms. There will also be contact restrictions. But for those affected, the idea of government-mandated vaccinations is more worrying than catching the virus. With a third of its population not entirely inoculated, Germany is lagging behind other EU nations. And a recent study shows the majority of those not yet inoculated want to avoid the COVID-19 vaccine by all means.
I think this is a violation and goes a step too far.
It is exaggerated. Certainly it is a special situation, there is no question about that. But I do not consider the situation to be so uncontrollable that they have to forego basic rights.
Neighboring Austria has become the first country to make jabs compulsory from February next year. In Greece, they will be mandatory for over 60-year-olds. And European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen says it's time for the entire EU to take the same step. Olaf Scholz says the German vaccination mandate could take effect from February if Parliament agrees.
Germany is joining a growing number of EU countries considering mandatory vaccinations. Ursula von der Leyen says she supports it, the EU Commission chief. A move like this, even during a health pandemic, it does bring up the question of personal freedom, does it not?
It does, but we've had this conversation, I suppose, for the past 2 years. Even things like lockdowns, restrictions, give up the question about personal freedoms. But of course, as Ursula von der Leyen and others are saying, this is a crisis. But I'm joined now by Liam Herrick, who's the Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, on this. Liam, talk us through the balance that needs to be weighed up in relation to the greater good of society. We've seen, obviously, a disproportionate number of people taking up ICU beds who are unvaccinated versus an individual's freedom to decide not to be vaccinated.
Well, I think in terms of the public health effort more generally, in terms of any restrictions that states are trying to implement, they need to be justified as proportionate. So they need to demonstrate that the public health benefit outweighs the imposition of people's rights. When we come to medical treatment, there are very strong rights under the European Convention on Human Rights in terms of private life, private and family life, and bodily integrity. So the state would have a very high bar to meet to either mandate directly or indirectly a particular medical treatment. And across Europe, you've had historically very different approaches to this question. In countries like Ireland, for example, there's a strong tradition of voluntary vaccination. And in other Central European countries, there has been a tradition of quite commonplace to make vaccination mandatory. And that would, of course, be culturally relevant as well. What's interesting, of course, is that many of the countries that have had the most high rates of take-up of vaccination have been countries with a voluntary program. So mandatory vaccination programs don't necessarily achieve a higher result.
But I suppose they do if, like in Austria, you're going to be charged €7,000 for not being vaccinated, that could be a criminal offence. And, you know, from the state's point of view, this isn't about imposing something on someone. It's about saying the rest of society is suffering because people won't get vaccinated. We've seen in hospitals in Ireland people not being able to get a lung transplant because the ICUs were filled. And so where does, I suppose, the social contract and the greater good of society impinge on the individual's rights?
Well, I think the starting point is to appreciate how severe a measure it is to mandate a particular form of treatment, because how important we value privacy, and particularly with regard to medical treatment. So the World Health Organization has been very clear that mandatory vaccination laws or policies must be a measure of last resort. So it's incumbent on the state to exhaust all other measures first of all. That includes other measures to encourage vaccination on a voluntary basis, which have been very successful in many countries, and also needs to be in the round of all of the other public health tools available to a state. So in many countries, there's been an underinvestment in other measures such as ventilation, contact tracing, testing, and so on. And I think the state would have to demonstrate that it exhausted all of these measures to their maximum potential before it could justify resorting towards a mandatory vaccination policy.
Europe's biggest economy, Germany, is edging closer to imposing controversial mandatory vaccination. And the move is making waves in a country where a significant section of society are resistant to getting a COVID-19 shot. On Thursday, the government announced that an ethics committee would draft legislation and the Bundestag would debate and vote on the measure in February at the latest.
I would call it rape. I think this is one step too far, because we shouldn't forget there are reasonable people out there too.
I am against mandatory vaccinations. I think everyone should decide for themselves. People should be able to choose to either go into hiding or to get vaccinated.
The unvaccinated were also barred from access to all but the most essential businesses on Thursday, such as grocery stores, pharmacies and bakeries. Outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel said that she felt depressed by the strong fourth wave of the virus, and now there is also the discovery of the Omicron strain to contend with. Germany's vaccination rate hovers around the 60 to 70% mark, a lower average than its European neighbours. Many worry about side effects, fears that experts say are overblown and are far outweighed by the risk of catching the virus. Berlin psychologist Sophie Reisker.
When the people feel that there's no rhyme or reason to the rules, then they feel like they're being taken advantage of. And if you add to that people are experiencing many things at once, people are very dissatisfied with the government's handling of corona, both those pro and anti-vaccines. That, at least, is a unifying factor, and really feel helpless with the situation.
In December 2020, almost a third of Germans said in a poll that they would not have a coronavirus vaccine. Radical anti-vaxxers have regularly flouted rules to protest restrictive measures, but they are a small percentage of a larger group of vaccine skeptics. Virologists blame the renewed outbreak on resistance to vaccination and have criticised politicians for acting too late to rein in contagion.
When I talked to American Alicia Duren and her German husband Andreas, they were packing, trying to get out of Germany as quickly as possible with their 3 children. They've had enough of Germany's strict COVID policies. Europe is in the midst of an uprising of the unvaccinated, pitting citizens who refuse to get the jab against governments that want the pandemic to end. And neither side is backing down. Nation by nation, Europe is turning into a 2-tiered society in which those who refuse to be vaccinated will live under lockdown, without full access to society or jobs, facing fines and even jail. The Durans are leaving Germany after Andreas became unable to work because of COVID restrictions.
I'm not allowed to work anywhere anymore, really, without providing a proof of vaccination or recovery.
Well, there's also no more privacy. Like, you go into the bakery and the cashier will loudly ask you for your vaccine pass if you want to go have a cup of coffee.
Are you vaccinated?
No, like very loudly. The discrimination is terrible.
It's a similar story across Europe. In Italy, the unvaccinated now must take a COVID test every 48 hours if they want to live a free life. Gunnar Beck, a German member of the European Parliament, calls Europe's COVID policies dangerously authoritarian.
I mean, we're not talking about the Black Death here. I'm not even sure the Black Death would warrant the effective suspension of the rule of law, constitutional government and democracy.
Austria is ground zero for the world's toughest COVID policies. The unvaccinated have already been in lockdown for almost a month, and next year will have to pay $4,000 in fines every 3 months unless they not only get vaccinated, but get booster shots. Eric Hewitt is an American living in Austria with his wife and 5 children.
The government is attempting to transform the society into a totalitarian police state.
Hewitt's unvaccinated children have been kicked out of music school for refusing daily COVID tests. When shopping, their family is only allowed to enter grocery stores and pharmacies.
The toy store. Wouldn't let my wife in to buy a toy for her birthday.
Medical privacy, still a law in Austria, has been breached by the government. The state knows who has and who hasn't been vaccinated, and there are fears the government will use vaccine passports to include new Chinese-style digital identities. Catholic activist Alexander Chuguel says Austrians have become the lab rats of the Western world and believes the Austrian experiment will spread.
Do you want a government which enforces things like abortion, homosexual marriage, other things? So a government which definitely shows that they do not only not follow the teaching of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, but rather fight against it. Do you want them to have every information available and full control of where you're allowed to go and where you're not allowed to go, like in China? I say no, and that's the reason we go and protest.
Hewitt has decided to stay in Austria and fight.
God has placed me at a critical battle in the spiritual war. The whole society is becoming this inhuman machine based on fear and repression. So what we want, I want to restore a human society.
But the Durans in Germany have had enough.
It's beautiful when people want to stay and fight, but we feel like the fight is lost here.
They see Germany laying the groundwork for its own nationwide vaccine mandate that could include children. Germany's COVID restrictions have been so draconian, this German mother says her 10-year-old daughter wants to die. Beck believes if Germany introduces a vaccine mandate, the EU will follow with a European-wide mandate. Most Europeans are vaccinated, although far fewer have gotten boosters. In Sweden, enthusiastic citizens are voluntarily injecting their vaccine passports into their hands in the form of readable microchips. The protests against Europe's COVID policies are now as far-flung as Barcelona to Brussels, to Kiev in Ukraine, to Zagreb in the Balkans, where this Croatian IT expert said, "I came here to fight against fascism, totalitarianism, these insane restrictions, and insane politicians." Protesters are demanding what they used to take for granted: freedom. Dale Hurd.
As we see, some countries are using to give boosters to kill children, which is not right.
New coronavirus restrictions have come into force here in Germany as it attempts to slow the spread of the Omicron variant. With New Year's Eve fast approaching, the government is placing tighter limits on public and private celebrations. It's also urging those still unvaccinated to get the jab. Just before the new restrictions took effect, people protested in cities across the country.
Hundreds of people demand to pass. Tensions ran high on the streets of Zittau in the eastern state of Saxony on Monday night. Just one of many protests organized across the country against the government's coronavirus restrictions and COVID-19 vaccines. It was a tense but a peaceful protest. In the nearby town of Bautzen, police were attacked with fireworks and bottles as they attempted to break up an unauthorized protest. Authorities reported at least 10 officers injured. In the capital, Berlin, there is little understanding of the violence that has erupted, and for those who still refuse to get vaccinated. We all get every mandatory vaccine when we go on holiday without questioning it, so what's happening now is ridiculous. I think it's not necessary to take to the streets and attack police officers. To use violence, you should do it peacefully. We're all in the same boat, so why do some have to kick up a fuss? I don't know if it's the right way, but people probably don't know how else to express themselves. Almost a year to the day after the vaccination campaign started, Berlin Mayor Franziska Giffey visited a COVID-19 intensive care unit. She repeated the government's plea to the quarter of the population still unvaccinated in Germany.
Lassen Sie sich impfen.
Get vaccinated. I can only say it again and again. The people lying here in this hospital, many of them are probably thinking, if only I had done it. Perhaps then it would have prevented this from happening. There are opponents to the vaccine and the measures, but over half of the population support measures now in place. But officials are bracing themselves for a new wave of infections with the more transmissible Omicron variant, which could overwhelm Germany's critical healthcare infrastructure.
Well, joining us is Hayot Sieb. He's a professor of epidemiology at the University of Bremen here in Germany. Hi, welcome to DW. Now, over a quarter of the German population is still unvaccinated. So what actually can be done at this stage to convince them to get the jab?
Yeah, this is a difficult task. It's not a homogeneous group. Obviously, there are some who will still go for the jab. They will need information. They will need sort of low barrier access to vaccination, and that will work. But we also have a hardened group of people for whom it's more of a Weltanschauung thing. It's not really about vaccination. It's more about opposition in general. And those ones, it's much harder to reach, and I'm afraid we won't reach them with what is on offer now.
Germany's Constitutional Court has ordered Parliament to immediately issue laws protecting people with disabilities in pandemic-related triage situations. Now, triage is the process of prioritising patients for treatment. For example, if hospitals are unable to cope with demand for intensive care. The case was filed by a group of people with disabilities and pre-existing conditions. They expressed fears they would be denied treatment if the pandemic pushes hospitals to their limits. Well, joining us for more is Professor Peter Dabrock. He is the former chair of the German Ethics Council and specialises in the ethics of technical and scientific interference with human life. Hi, Professor Dabrock, and welcome to the show. Now, why did people with disabilities feel they needed to go to court to get a ruling on this?
First, thanks for having me. They are concerned that because of their fear of disabilities, they might be disadvantaged in the case of shortage of medical treatment. This is the reason why they went to Karlsruhe, the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court came to the ruling that the legislator has immediately and rapidly to change the legal frame in order to protect these people.
Right, well then, from an ethical point of view, how can doctors make a choice of who lives or who dies in their hospital?
First of all, it's fair to say that this is one of the most challenging situations for doctors at all, because of the potential shortage of medical treatment. So they have to balance, on the one hand, to meet the legal requirements. On the other hand, they have also to meet ethical criteria as the prospect of surveillance, of survival, and on the other hand, also the basic dignity of each human being. And this is extremely difficult to balance in this given catastrophic situation. And therefore, we have to look for this balancing in order not to limit the scope of action for doctors, and on the other hand, nevertheless, to keep the frame of the constitutional frame. And this is so extremely difficult to manage.
Professor Peter Dabrock, thank you for joining us on DW.
Germany now has some of the world's strictest rules for people who are not fully vaccinated against COVID-19. The country also has a vocal minority who refuse to get the jab. Many subscribe to conspiracy theories and call themselves querdenkers or transgressive thinkers. They've been protesting against the increasing rules in Germany, and now many are so fed up, they're leaving. Some anti-vaxxers are now looking to get away from the lockdowns and restrictions of their homeland, even to places as far off as South America. Hello and welcome to Deutsche Welle's COVID-19 special. I'm Stephen Beardsley in Berlin. With every wave of COVID-19 illnesses in Germany comes a new backlash from those strongly opposed to the health measures taken in response, including vaccination. Protests and refusal to wear a mask in public places are the actions that most commonly take. Some, however, have gone to more extreme measures.
Olga and Vola Kohn came to Hohenau in December 2020. It's a small town with around 15,000 inhabitants in the south of Paraguay. It was founded in 1900 by German settlers. The Kohns appreciate the peace and quiet here in the countryside. The Kohns emigrated from Stuttgart in southwestern Germany to Paraguay, together with Vola's brother and his wife. They say they can lead a free life here without COVID restrictions, staying healthy for many more years. We have more time for ourselves. That's what it looks like. Keeping animals, growing our own plants. Just living freely, that's the plan. More than 1,000 people have moved from Germany to Paraguay in the last year. The Kohn brothers want to set up a business repairing cars like they did in Germany. They hope they can have time for their family life outside of work. In Germany, both of us were employed. We both worked. The kids were in school and in kindergarten. We hardly saw each other, sometimes for 2 or 3 days, because I had to work more to earn money. Some of those who have emigrated here are turning their back on COVID restrictions in Europe. Vitali Fuchs, who now works as a pastor for the community in Hohenau, explains the high number of migrants with his religious perspective. And then I found Paraguay on a world map, and God said, "The time has come and you will be there." And as it was said, so it came to pass. I also led an online forum, and my subject was a wave of migrants to Paraguay. Other members of the German community in Hohenau, like Inge Hase, who arrived a few months ago from the US, are much more forthcoming about their rejection of the COVID measures and vaccines. All of that isn't something Paraguay should go along with, she says. I decided to come here because we noticed that through this coronavirus situation, everything was tightening up, becoming more difficult, because more and more people actually had to flee Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. They lost their jobs, and soon they won't be able to go out shopping. And now they're announcing a vaccine mandate. It still remains to be seen just which COVID measures Paraguay will implement in the course of the pandemic. Until then, the immigrant families will try to find their new home here.
Andreas Zick is professor for socialization and conflict research at the University of Bielefeld here in Germany. Professor, thank you for joining us on the show. Would you ever have imagined that it would get to this point where people would actually immigrate overseas because of COVID-19 measures?
No, the immigration of groups, especially families, is not a new pattern. Members of the protests have already emigrated and supporters live abroad. They've emigrated to reasons of conviction as well as to escape prosecution. So we have enclaves, we have some enclaves in Canada, where a former journalist offers real estates. We know that one of the most radical spokesmen is now living in Turkey. We know the formation of diaspora communities historically. It's one of the strategies of the protesters and the deniers to cope with the situation. But what is now relevant is to observe what happens in these colonies. Is there further radicalization? Are they producing propaganda? And we need to link it to the multiple forms of protest in the immigration. It's one part. The social media offer a lot of possibilities to create these parallel societies and communities.
You said that it's just one part of this protest. Does it tell us something important about the intensity of the opposition here in Germany and other countries, or is it fringe? How would you look at it?
No, we would say that this is one element and maybe the last step in the process of radicalization. So the one group is leaving the country, the other group are further radicalizing into a polarized ideology and into violence. When we speak about radicalization, I speak about radicalization into ideology and violence, but this immigration is one part. It's a central element. Why? Because the distancing to the former system, the distancing to the former networks. So the distance to traditional and majority norms and rules is one of the most relevant elements in this radicalization. And it's growing. We saw in the last week, we saw around 50,000 people in Germany in the streets. We have over 33,000 right-wingers who count themselves among them. We have network of the corona deniers. The studies by the universities of Vienna and Edinburgh estimate that nearly 9% of the population in Germany belong to these deniers. And it's a very heterogeneous group, and the distance is a central element.
Not too long ago, in fact, we saw a torchlight march in front of the house of the health minister in Saxony. That's a German state.
Yeah.
Do you expect to see more violence, especially as we near this debate on a vaccine mandate in Germany?
There is a clear evidence of further radicalization when we define radicalization as extreme ideologies and violence. We have an increase in public statistics in group-based and racist-based hate crimes. We see many protests. It's not that the amount of people is increasing. So the Corona protests in 2020, we saw huge protests, but now it's going very much local, and the people who are now in this movement become very extreme. And the mandatory vaccination, the topic of mandatory vaccination was always the bridge to the center of society. So, for example, in spring this year, we run a representative survey in Germany, and 70% in this representative survey agreed to the statement Corona is used compulsory vaccination, and 18% partially agreed. And this mandatory vaccination is not perceived by the protesters as something which is good to fight the coronavirus, but it is a complete giving up of their freedom, and it's increasing the idea we have to show resistance right now. We are losing all our rights.
All right, Andreas Zick is a professor of socialization and conflict research at the University of Bielefeld here in Germany. Thank you very much.
In Berlin's theaters, there's an acceptance that you can't be safe enough. Audience members have, of course, to show their vaccine passport, but also a negative test less than a day old.
I feel a lot safer now. With this double system, I can at least go to the theater a lot more often.
Bisschen aufwendiger wird es, ja. Aber man hat sich an vieles gewöhnt.
The new rules, passport and test, came into force at the end of December in cultural venues. Another constraint, but a welcome one, as attendance was dropping in recent weeks.
We have felt a lot of hesitation from the public in recent times, but with the resurgence of the pandemic, the new measures are rather well accepted.
The double system could be copied across Germany as the overall situation worsens with the spread of the Omicron variant. In this French restaurant in Berlin, reservations dropped when the vaccine passport was introduced in November, but the regulars kept coming. A compulsory test, though, could change that, says the owner.
Also ich glaube, dass diese spontane Essen gehen, die werden definitiv wegfallen. Weil dieses Essen gehen wird jetzt irgendwie eine ganze Tagesplanung in Anspruch nehmen.
But the buildup of requirements to enjoy everyday life seems to be having an effect on the unvaccinated. People who refuse to even the first jab are starting to change their minds.
I think a number of people are still doing the wait and see, but the pressure created by the increased contaminations and by the new restrictive measures put in place by the authorities are obviously pushing them to get vaccinated.
Since the vaccine passport was announced, more than 5 million people decided to get their first shot.
Schafe sind Sympathieträger in der Bevölkerung und Überträger emotionaler Botschaften. Und so können vielleicht viele Menschen emotional erreicht werden, wenn die Logik und die wissenschaftliche Argumentation nicht hinhaut.
Normalerweise füttert Schäfer Steffen seine Tiere im Stall. Heute ist das Futter Mittel zum Zweck.
Also ich lege jetzt hier eine Brotspur aus für die Schafe, damit die wissen, wo die stehen sollen, damit es das richtige Bild ergibt nachher.
Eine Impfspritze soll das Bild darstellen. Und um die rund 700 tierischen Impfbotschafter zu motivieren, gibt es nicht nur Brot, sondern auch noch ein spezielles Topping.
Das sind Pellets. Da ist unter anderem Melasse drin, die also süß schmeckt. Das ist die Marmelade aufs Brot.
Es ist angerichtet. Fehlen nur noch die Gäste. Die bringt Steffens Frau Wiebke mit. Und plötzlich Szenen wie im Cluburlaub bei der Buffet-Eröffnung. Die Schafe und Ziegen drängeln sich um die besten Plätze zum Futtern. Die Mischung aus Brot und Pellets scheint zu schmecken. Und nicht nur das, Schäfer Steffens Plan hat funktioniert. Seine Tiere sind heute Impfbotschafter aus der Lüneburger Heide.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. Tune in again next week when we talk about scurvy. If your teeth are falling out, not to worry. You're in fine British seafaring tradition. This is Dr. Jack Worthing, and remember to stay well, well, well.
Trample on snakes.